Now, one way of working around, and not the only way, as you will soon see, would be to create a new component. A post form component, for example, in a separate post form.js file. Here I'll create a separate post form component function. And the idea behind this component is to have all that code that includes useFormState and the rendering of this form, so that I grab all that code from the new post page.js file and move that into the post form component, like this. And I need a closing bracket here. So now the post form component has the useFormState hook and all the markup that renders the form. Now it won't work like this. For example, the form submit import is missing, and the useFormState hook import is missing, and of course we don't have access to this create post action here, so we need to fix these things. And I'll start with the imports. In page.js, I will actually grab the import of the useFormState hook and remove it from there, and actually also remove the useClient directive from there, cut all that, and add it here at the top of the post form component file. And I'll also grab this form submit component import, cut it from the new post page file, and add that here in the post form.js file instead. Now that form and that hook here is in a separate component. Now that hook needs access to the create post server action though. And what we can do here and what works is that we simply accept that as a prop, because you can pass server actions through props, and you can indeed pass them from a React server component to a client component. That works and is allowed. You just can't define them in a client component file, but you can pass them from a server component to a client component. And that's what I'll do here. Now I'll name my prop action and then use that prop here as a value in the useFormState hook. And with that done, back here in the page.js file, we can and should go down there and now simply return that post form and set this action prop to the create post server action function like this. And with that, we're now defining that server action in a server component, which is how it should be. And we're then passing it to a client component, which will work. And now with that, if we do that, you see the error is gone and this new post page reloads successfully. You will also see, however, that if I now click create post, I'm getting some error. I'm getting some error that form data get is not a function. So that code in my form action suddenly fails, and previously it of course worked fine. Why is that the case? Well, the code in this form action is now failing because now we no longer get form data as a first argument in that server action. And we're no longer getting that because we're funneling this server action through the useFormState hook. We're passing it as a first argument to useFormState. Now I mentioned that we get back a new form action, which we can set on the form, but React will actually not just listen to the submission of the form and update that state, but it will also change the way the form action, the server action we're passing to useFormState will be called. It will still give us access to the form data, but it will no longer do so as a first argument. Instead, the first argument will be the previous form state now, and the second argument will be the submitted form data. So if we had more complex logic in our server action, where we might want to return a new form state based on the previous form state, we could do that with help of that pref state object, which we get automatically because we're passing this server action to the useFormState hook. And in our case, that, for example, would give us that initial state object. That's what we could retrieve from pref state. Here I don't need it, but still, This is how we now need to write this server action, because the forum data will now actually be the second argument. So with that though, we will be able to click create post without getting an error, but of course we now don't get any feedback here. We don't see those error messages we're creating in our server-side code. And the reason for that simply is that we're not using this state yet. And keep in mind that this state will be that object that has this errors property, which stores this errors array. But we're not using that, hence of course we're not showing it on the screen. But we can now simply use it here in the post form component to output those error messages. For example, by going to the bottom of this form, and then here we can output those error messages dynamically by checking if state errors is defined. So if we have an errors property in the state object, and if that's the case, I want to output an unordered list here, which I'll give a class name of forum-errors. And then here inside of that unordered list, I want to map my errors, so my error messages, which are strings, to list items. Now every list item will receive a key, which is simply the error message, and then I'll output the error message between those list item tags. Well, and with that, if you saved it, you should now see those error messages down there, if you're not submitting any data. Now, as you see, I don't get any error regarding the image, even though I haven't added any image here, because indeed image will always be an object, even if nothing was submitted. And therefore, I actually want to add an extra check here and check if image size is equal to 0, which means it's an invalid image file. With this extra check added, now I also get this image error message if no image file was chosen. And with that, we now made sure that we don't just give the user some feedback regarding whether the form is being submitted or not, but that we also provide some validation to the user, some server-side validation around which the user can't work.